This is Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I am James Shao, and today I am with my co-hosts, Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hey.
We are finishing up our discussion today of Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This is the first book in our series, Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. Our discussion may contain spoilers. If you haven't read the book, you can find our spoiler-free review episode in our archives. Next week, we will move on to the next book in our series, Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld. It's a novel that asks, what if Hillary Rodham never married Bill Clinton? You know, it's weird to say Hillary Rodham. I actually never put it together that was her maiden name.
I did not either.
We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. If you'd like to chat with us, you can find us on social media at CanonicalPod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod.
So, James, you've read more historical fiction than I have.
Yes.
Categorically. Is it common to have quotations and excerpts from contemporary sources peppered throughout?
No.
Next question.
I actually brought this up a few weeks ago when we talked about the Garlic Ballads, and I called it a documentary novel. A documentary novel is, I found out, not a very common term, but people do use the term. It's when you use texts in this manner. In the Garlic Ballads, we talked about briefly how in one of the versions, Mo Yen used newspaper headlines in his novel, which would make it a documentary novel of sorts. And in this case, I think if the texts are real, and I'd say that probably matters, then it would be a kind of documentary novel, and it's not a very common kind of historical fiction. People who use it, have to deal with the affectation of having that text in the book.
Well, you're getting a little bit ahead of me.
So par for the course.
Yeah. Because I wanted to ask what the effect is, but more importantly, I wanted to ask if all of these are real. But we already know, and we've already mentioned in a previous episode, I believe, that they are not necessarily all real. Some of these are. I looked some up to see, and then some are not. So does it matter? You just said that you think it does. How so? In what way?
When I said it does, I mean in terms of like this very narrow confine of a subgenre of a documentary novel, because a documentary novel is purporting to report on real historical events, and you can write historical fiction without that reporting. In that way, yeah, it matters if you're trying to squeeze it into a subgenre. Generally speaking, I think we touched on this. I forget if it was last week or the week before. We talked about how it lends this kind of truthiness versus truthfulness to the book. Having it makes it seem very truthy, but if it's false, then it's not very truthful. So it adds an extra layer to the book that I thought was interesting. And I don't particularly care if it was real or not, but I think raising that question is interesting.
I think that most people are the same. They'd say, yes, some of them are not true, but my question is, would it matter if none of them were true, if they were all fake? I would say it would, but I'm not sure if that is violating some sort of a rule or promise that he's making as a storyteller, or if it's just kind of my presumption of how text should be attributed and how things should be justified.
In the context of what we were talking about last week, in terms of how to read the novel, if it were a sincere proffering of a point of view, a religious aspect of the book, I don't know if it does matter to me anymore. I don't know if it matters that some are real and some are not. I don't know if it would matter to me if they were all made up. If they were all made up, it might make me just lean even more into the fact that he's a storyteller rather than a religious writer, spiritual writer.
It would break the illusion. Like, I think it doesn't matter that they are working as disguises, but they have to be good disguises. If they're clearly bad disguises for the truth, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, the effect is much more important. And if it's done well while you're reading the book, you would never think to check if it was real or not. Or even if you think about it, you would say, I'll just keep on reading.
So, bearing that in mind, I want to focus on one section of the book, the back half specifically. Because while I think that the novel might have something to say about grief throughout, I'm much more interested in whether it offers something worthwhile beyond that. We've talked a little bit about this already, but I think it shows us a lot about personal anguish over the death of a loved one. But I think the real message is one that moves toward a larger message, looking at history, which to me feels like the point in choosing to write a story in this way. In the back half of the book, we're introduced to a number of black spirits who, like the other spirits, express their regrets and pains and experiences of death. And at one point, they plead with Lincoln to help them. One of them wants revenge, and the others, at the very least, want escape from suffering, or they want their families to be released from this constant misery of slavery. And when they join in entering Lincoln with the other spirits en masse to try to get him to commune with his son, so that Willie can leave the Bardo and enter the true afterlife, whatever that might be, I think the mission changes. And suddenly it's not just about helping a single dead boy, but about expediting two different but related futures. The first one is ending the Civil War as swiftly as possible, and the second is ending slavery. So as a reminder, this book takes place in December of 1862, and the Emancipation Proclamation was issued January 1st, 1963.
1863.
Oh, yes. 1863.
So he waited a long time.
You know what? He had to wait until Kennedy. Kennedy was the right guy. No doubt the pain of losing his child would affect him and inform his actions as commander-in-chief, presiding over this terribly bloody war. And perhaps to his actions and feelings about slavery. But I feel like we can't treat those things equally. But I want to explore that with you two. So first of all, is that how you read this as well? That this one death of his son is the impetus for Lincoln's trying to shorten the war as soon as possible?
Do you mean in the novel or in history?
In the novel.
In the novel, no. I think in history, there is a potential to read them as being related, and that may have been what inspired Saunders, but I wouldn't agree with that in either case.
I would really like to hear more about that because
Well, I mean, I don't know enough about 1860s history, but it seems a little bit glib to say, okay, his son died and that made Lincoln want to fight harder in the Civil War. It just seems superficial.
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's part of what I took from this book is that he's taking this death of his son so hard that he transfers that immediately to the Civil War. Obviously, they're both happening at the same time. And as we get in this novel, both are weighing on him even before Willie dies. Part of that truthiness historical aspect is we see a sick boy and we see Lincoln grappling with, the beginnings of the Civil War.
I can understand the reading that you're presenting, but I just don't think there's enough evidence in the book for me to go along with it. Specifically about shortening the war, not about the other part. The other part I can definitely see.
There is that speech where he says, "It will be bloody and I won't understand it, but I have to kind of subsume my will to something even bigger. And I have to do this because we cannot be defeated. We must win." That, to me, I think is an important scene of the novel. And I think that's what Sam was thinking of just now.
Yeah. And there's a section where he talks about, I believe in the same section or a connecting chapter to when the parents of various soldiers are writing to him. He says, "Our grief must be defeated. It must not become our master and make us ineffective. We must, to do the maximum good, bring the thing to its swiftest halt and kill more efficiently. Must end suffering by causing more suffering." His heart dropped at the thought of the killing. I actually felt more strongly about this than the second part I feel like this makes more sense to me than his wanting to end slavery. We'll get to the slavery bit in a second, but this feels more direct, I guess, a more direct connection.
This reminds me of something that I read in college about Ralph Waldo Emerson. He had a son called Waldo who died actually about 20 years before Willie Lincoln died. And he wrote about his son's death in a long poem, and scholars have seen a similar turning point after the death of Waldo in Emerson's worldview as the turning point that we see in this novel with Lincoln, where before Emerson kind of thought about man as master of nature and in control of his situation. And afterwards, he wrote about man as being kind of at the mercy of something much larger that he couldn't understand. And I think it's very similar to what happens here. It's this kind of incomprehensible thing where you don't want suffering, but to stop suffering, you have to create more suffering. And it boggles the mind. But Lincoln has to just admit, I can't understand this, but I have to do it.
Did Ralph end up writing a lot of children's books about looking for a son?
He did not, but I suppose that would have been much better than a career as an essayist.
That's too bad. I thought he was the progenitor of Where's Waldo.
I didn't see where you were going with that. Good. I actually have more problems with the second part of this. That even though the timeline works out, that this led directly to him ending slavery. I don't want to minimize the Emancipation Proclamation. It is a remarkable and landmark historical document.
A top 2 in the history of proclamations.
And Lincoln is certainly a great man for it, but I think we need to be clear about what it is and what it is not. It did not abolish slavery, for example. That did not happen until the 13th Amendment, which was ratified after his death.
I mean, do you mean that he wouldn't have done it if he lived?
No, I mean, Lincoln was anti-slavery, and that is something that he maintained from the beginning of his career. And I also don't want to minimize Lincoln's efforts. I think he was dealing with his powers as vested by the Constitution, which are limited. But the proclamation didn't free all slaves. It freed, what was it, something like 3.5 million out of 4 million in the US. It freed the ones from the states in rebellion, not the border states that stayed within the Union. The reason I bring this up is it feels, to use your word, Iad, it feels glib to have these spirits entering him and pushing some kind of change within him. I feel like it cheapens it in some way. It somehow both aggrandizes what he did and also minimizes it at the same time.
I see what you mean. I think that you're right in that the book kind of borrows a little bit of its shine from our affection for Abraham Lincoln in mainstream America. We like Lincoln, so therefore we should like this book, right? But if you are, as you seem to be, taking Lincoln down a peg now, you're saying, okay, Lincoln's not so hot, Saunders isn't either.
No, it's not that. It's that I feel like it kind of cheapens it in that it's not even the timeline that bothers me. It's these spirits that enter him, and it makes it this emotional thing versus a practical thing or at best I could say, okay, there's a spiritual aspect to this, but it's a spiritual aspect from without Lincoln, not from within him. It cheapens it by making it not something that started within him, but it also aggrandizes it as being this larger than life, supernatural, spiritual thing.
Yeah. To my thinking, it makes it seem like it wasn't a strategic decision. It makes it seem like it was a purely moral decision. And of course it wasn't. Nothing in politics is. So it is a little bit ahistorical in that sense, that it makes it much more of a feel-good moment than a realistic moment.
You know, neither of those two issues really bothered me. And I suppose it's because I came at the book differently from you, Sam, in that for me, this ability that the spirits have to meld is really about empathy. And I understand that, you're kind of simplifying the Emancipation Proclamation by saying it was about him just being a good man and doing the right thing. But I think we kind of established that this book isn't really historical in that way. Like, it's not a study of Lincoln. So, in storytelling, I think if you take that shortcut, it doesn't bother me.
I can see why he wanted to take such a shortcut. I think it's worth remembering that this book was published in 2017, in the middle of a particularly dark period for somebody of Saunders's political leanings. And it was very desirable to have a good American president to think about. And I think that at that moment, a lot of Americans probably felt the same way. They would really like to have a good Lincoln to think about because we had somebody who seemed very, very bad in our real lives.
In that light, it's interesting to me that he chose this moment to write about because he didn't need to write this about Lincoln. It does not need to center on, a real person. But it's something that more or less every American can point to and understand to some degree. While there are conflicting opinions about Lincoln, most people can agree that, the Emancipation Proclamation was a good idea.
Most.
Right. I'm sure there still are people out there that disagree.
If the germ of this novel is this image of a grieving father who's holding his dead son, and you work at developing this story, and you have some interest in Buddhism, your worldview is influenced by Buddhism, how important is this historical fact of, the Emancipation Proclamation having strategic value? I'm just saying, in the process of writing the story and in understanding what the story is, I'd say that kind of historical context is very important in a history textbook. But this is not a history textbook. So I always feel like when I read this or hear this criticism, because I know that another critic, Hari Kunzru, I believe, with Guardian, said something similar about it being glib. And he was someone who I think I quoted maybe a couple of months ago when he wrote about Jennifer Egan and Krasznahorkai. I think it was Kunzru who wrote, about Krasznahorkai as well. I just feel like that's missing the mark. It's focusing on an aspect of the novel that the author is not really focused on. And there are always things you could say, well, this author neglected this historical context, or this author didn't represent this aspect fully. I mean, it just seems like very low-hanging fruit to target it. The heart of the novel is not about that. And the critics who focus on that, it just kind of feels to me like, well, you've talked about everything else. Let's also have our moment here where we talk about why it doesn't work. It's almost unrelated.
I think the reason why this is persuasive to Sam, and forgive me, Sam, I'll say that you might be the most woke of the three of us. And
Jesus Christ.
Sam is nodding vigorously. He's very agreeing. But because you are woke, you are perhaps more willing and more aware of the tendency of, dominant culture, mainstream white America, to prioritize the good feelings of history above the facts of injustice. And you have a desire to see those facts of injustice brought to light because that's important to you. And I think what James is saying is that for Saunders and for most readers of this novel, the story and the feelings matter more than those facts. And I think both perspectives are fine, but I think it's almost part of these culture wars where Sam is one of these, young hipsters and James is like the establishment white dude.
Yeah, I kind of want to use one of these phrases that a basketball analyst I listen to says really frequently, which is like, what are you even doing here? That's what I wanted to say. Not when I read your comment, Sam, and listened to you, but when I read Hari Kunzru, I was like, oh man, this guy again. Like, I had to listen to him rant about Egan and American fiction when talking about Crush and Hawkeye. Now he throws in this thing about, oh, glib. I was like, all right, buddy. You got to get your dig in.
You're talking about facts, but in the last episode, we were talking about the feelings of this and the, metaphysical aspects of this. If those aren't feelings.
Well, that's the thing, is the woke position is facts over feelings when the facts support emancipatory politics and social justice. That's when the facts matter. So in one sense, maybe I'm saying that, the woke position is incoherent, but I understand where they're coming from. They feel like their position has been marginalized. And when they have a chance to say, look, this is not the truth, they're going to say it. But other times, when the feelings take charge over the facts, they're going to remain silent. Like, is that a problem?
I don't know if I agree, because I feel like the glib aspect that I'm talking about is a matter of feelings, is a matter of emotion.
I mean, there's the emotion that we have that we love Lincoln generally, and we want to tell good stories about him because we like him. And we simplify history because we want to feel good about people that we like. That's the emotional part of it. And that you feel that it's glib is also an emotional response to it. But I think the reason why you feel it's glib is based on the facts, right?
I mean, my point isn't even that, really. It kind of goes to what I said earlier, I believe, in this episode, where I said, maybe Lincoln is just flavor, because I think what I'm about to say is strange, but what if it wasn't Lincoln? What if it was just some other person? You would lose a lot from the novel, sure, but you would still have a lot of the impact of the novel. I mean, this is Iad's central argument before, where he said it's not really historical, it's about the afterlife and moving on and all that crap.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier about Lincoln being an easy cultural touchstone.
Yeah. My natural extension of that is, if Lincoln is treated in such a way, then it's kind of unfair to poke at all the ways he's not treating Lincoln fairly, when really he's just using him as flavor. And we're just pointing out the fact that people use Lincoln as a totem or whatever. I mean, that's almost a different argument. Like, this book isn't central to that argument. This book is one of 100 examples of how people use Lincoln to uphold certain values when maybe they're not true. But that's not the book. And this is where I think, not necessarily you, but this approach toward the book, I feel like it's unfair, because it's kind of like, yeah, you could always do that, but you could do it with almost every text, right? Almost every text that marginally touches on a sensitive topic, but does not fully explore it and take a, quote, what Iad's saying, a woke position. You could do it with any text. So the chief question then is, okay, does this text actively harm? If you're looking at it from this kind of woke perspective, is this text actively harmful? I mean, I think that's the question that if you were woke, you would be asking. I mean, I'm asking honestly, I don't think it is actively harmful.
I don't think it is either, especially when you take what we've already talked about in previous episodes, that the chief concern here is storytelling. I don't think the chief concern here is truthfulness or telling how did you put it, a positive spiritual aspect or point of view, rather.
I don't want to scare you guys, but we are very, very dangerously close to being a bunch of critical race theory opponents. We are becoming those podcasters who talk about, why don't these people just shut up and love Lincoln the way I love Lincoln?
I think my question, though, is a very key question toward, if you are trying to look at cultural icons and whether or not they're harmful, you have to ask the question, is this actively harmful? You can't just pick any person and say, I don't like this person because of X. I think you have to have that framework, which is, does revering Thomas Jefferson, is that actively harmful, right? And then you can discuss it. I think the question of is Lincoln and presenting the Emancipation Proclamation in this way, is that harmful to our discourse and how we understand history? I mean, I'd say at the very worst, it's shallow.
I mean, this is way outside of our topic, but what does a world look like without heroes? Because I think we're reaching a level of analysis of history where we're going to find less desirable aspects of everybody. Nobody is worth the level of scrutiny that we have available now. So if we have no heroes, what happens then? Now, I'm not saying that because it's so dangerous to not have heroes, we have to accept Lincoln, but I feel like that's the precipice. That's what we're at. That's the stakes involved.
But anyway, the answer to my question for me is no. Like, I don't think it's actively harmful. So I think
Thanks.
what are we even talking about here? Like, what are we doing here?
All right, we flogged the dead horse quite a bit here. Having talked so much about the novel, James and me, do we like it less now? And Sam, do you like it more?
I think I do like it more in general. I think that aspect still kind of bothers me a little bit, but it doesn't bother me that much. I mean, in truth, that was not pulling from my enjoyment of it that much.
I don't like it less because, as you know, I'm all about the story and the feels. And the fact that we've come to this conclusion where maybe he's not really an ideas man, that doesn't bother me. You know, I feel similarly about Pale Fire, right? I really like Pale Fire. But if you were to make some kind of coherent intellectual argument saying Pale Fire is really about X or whatever, I think you'd fail, right? Because it's not that kind of book. Of course, this is not as formally inventive and focused on form as Pale Fire. So you always have that argument. But yeah, I'm not disappointed after having talked about this over 3 weeks. I think this book is exactly what I thought about it when I finished this book.
I think my position is still that I like this novel a lot, but my kind of new framework is that this is the best that this novel could be from George Saunders. Like, I think he's trying to expand, and I think that I'm satisfied because I think that he has reached the limits of his powers.
He's no Laszlo Krasznahorkai.
You're giving him a pat on the back. There, George Saunders.
No, I feel like he has done his best, and I feel like his best is good enough. I see where it could be even more, but there is no upper limit to artistry. Like, anything could be done even better. So like, he has done the best George Saunders serious novel that George Saunders could do.
Gold star.
A for effort.
All right, well, on that kind of positive note, we'll stop. If you want to talk about how you felt about the book, you can let us know on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. You can give us a review on Apple or on YouTube. Next week, we'll be back with a review of Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.